I think that those questions did not remain embedded, buried in this rather obscure text, but that they took more and more importance in Western philosophy. When Fichte was concerned with this rather extraordinary event, it was not only that he felt he should bear a support on me, but what was the role of his own philosophy in this event? In a certain way, Hegel's philosophy is an attempt to answer this very simple question: what is the meaning of this day when so much as a result of the critique itself, but as a result of this critico-historical question: what are we now? I think that we can find in the field of philosophical activities since the beginning of the 19th century two poles which are related to each other and which cannot be reduced to each other. At one of these poles, you find such questions as: what is truth? How is it possible to know the truth? That is the pole of philosophy as formal ontology of truth or as critical analysis of knowledge. And at the other pole, you find such questions as: what is our actuality? What are we as part of this actuality? What is the target of our activity of philosophizing insofar as we are part of our actuality? Those questions deal with what I should call the historical ontology of ourselves, or the critical history of thought. It is in the framework of this second type of questions that I have undertook several historical inquiries about madness or medicine, crime and punishment, or about sexuality. Of course, there have been several ways, and there are still several ways for elaborating those questions about our historical ontology. But I think that any ontological history of ourselves have to analyze three sets of relations: our relations to truth, our relations to obligation, our relations to ourselves and to the others. Or, to turn it with other words, in order to answer the question, what are we now, we have to consider that we are thinking beings, since it is through thought that we are beings who look for truth, who accept or refuse obligations, laws, coercions, and who are related to ourselves or to the others. My aim is not to answer the general question, what is a thinking being? My aim is to answer the question, how did the history of our thought, I mean of our relation to truth, to obligations, to ourselves and to the others, make us what we are? In brief, how could we analyze the formation of ourselves through the history of our thought? And by thought, I do not mean exclusively philosophy, nor theoretical thinking, nor scientific knowledge. I don't want to analyze what people think opposed to what they do, but what they think, what they do when they are, what they think when they do what they are doing. What I want to analyze is the meaning they give to their own behavior, the way they integrate their behavior in general strategies, the type of rationality they recognize in their different practices, institutions, models, and behavior. When I was studying madness and psychiatry, crime and punishment, I have been led to emphasize the analysis of our relation first to truth and then to obligation. studying now the constitution of our experience of sexuality, I have been more and more inclined to pay attention to the relation to oneself and to the techniques through which those relations have been shaped. In order to analyze these techniques of the self, I'd like to choose as a point of departure a notion which has been, I think, very important in the Greek and in the Roman culture. I'll try tonight to give you a very short draft of the problems linked to this notion, and maybe we could elaborate this first resume during the meetings and seminars we'll have together during the next weeks. This notion, which I have chosen as a point of departure, is what the Greeks called epimeleia heautou, and the Latins cura sui. It's not very easy to translate these terms, but I'll try. Epimeleia heautou is something like the concern with oneself, or, as we say in French, le souci de soi. The verbal form, epimeleistai heautou, means something like to be concerned with oneself, to take care of oneself, s'occuper de soi-même. The precept that one has to take care of oneself, to be concerned with oneself, precept that one has to epimeleistai heautou, was for the Greeks and the Romans one of the main principles of ethics, one of the main rules for their art of life, and this for almost 1,000 years. Let's have a look at some marking points in this very long period. First, Socrates himself. In the Apology written by Plato, we see Socrates presenting himself before his judges as the master of the concern with oneself. He addresses passers-by and tells them, "You concern yourselves with your riches, with your reputation, with your honors, but you do not concern yourself with your virtue or with your soul." And Socrates watches over his fellow citizens to make sure that they take care of themselves. He considers that this task has been conferred on him by the god, and he will not abandon it except with his last breath. Well, 8 centuries later, the same notion of concern with oneself, epimeleia heautou, the same notion appears with a role equally very important in a Christian author, Gregory of Nyssa. But it has, in Gregory of Nyssa, a very different meaning. By this term, Gregory of Nyssa means the movement by which one renounces marriage, detaches oneself from the flesh, and by which, thanks to a virginity of heart and body, one recovers the immortality of which one has been deprived. In another passage of the same treatise of virginity, Gregory makes of the parable of the lost drachma the model of concern with oneself. For a lost drachma, you must light a lamp, turn the whole house over, search in every corner, until, gleaming in the shadows, you see the coin's metal. In the same way, in order to recover the effigy which God has printed in our soul and which the body has tarnished, one must take care of oneself, light the lamp of reason, and search every corner of the soul. Between those two extreme points of reference, Socrates and Gregory of Nyssa, one can state that the concern with oneself constituted not only a constant principle, but a very large practice. Amongst those philosophers who claim to be advisors on life and guides on existence, the principle of occupying oneself with oneself was almost universally accepted. Following their master, the Epicureans repeat that it is never too early and never too late to occupy oneself with one's soul,